All right, let's get started. So I'm going to focus on assessing your site conditions, as the title slide says, because you always want to put the right plant in the right place. I'm sure that's a phrase you've heard before. It's pretty familiar for gardeners. And the other one that goes along with that is don't fight the site. In other words, we have this tendency to do, like want to grow tropical plants in Connecticut, or alpine plants in Florida and that kind of thing. It's just, it's, I guess gardeners like the challenge, but I guess that's okay for certain things. Maybe like your house plants or something, you could be a little more exotic than your location allows. But for trees and shrubs, which is kind of what I'm going to focus on, yeah, not fighting the site is probably a better idea. And I'm talking mostly about trees and shrubs because your herbaceous plants, if you find that it's not happy where you put it, they can always be moved. Well, for the most part, some things really resent being moved, but for the most part, you can move things around and correct any mistakes that you may have made. So what is it that you should be assessing? And I apologize if this is a little too elementary for you, but I just wanted to cover everything. So the first thing you need to think about, and I'm looking over here because I have two screens. The first thing you want to think about is what climate zone are you in? So I'm talking about the USDA climate zones, which are based on minimum temperature. And besides that, you want to think about how much light you have, what kind of sunshine and at what time of the day. The water supply, how much moisture is in your soil naturally. The soil itself, we'll talk about texture and structure. Those are two different things, often confused. And pH, very important to know the pH of your soil. And other things we'll cover will be microclimates, some special conditions, site conditions, and a little bit of talk about design considerations. Okay, let's go back to climate zone. So here we are in Connecticut, and Connecticut has 3 zones. Down here at the shore, you will see a little bit of zone 7 because the water has a very moderating effect on the temperature, so you don't quite get as cold. And the 2 different shades of green are 6A and 6B. We are in 6A. We're kind of right on the border of 6A and 6B. As soon as you start getting north into New Milford and into the upper elevations there, you're getting into 6B, which is the colder part. So I consider that we're in 6A. And the other thing that you need to think about, but there isn't a really good system for, is how hot it gets in the summertime. So there is such a thing as a sunset climate zone. This is actually put out by Sunset Magazine. And as you can see from the explanations here, it's a little bit fuzzy. I guess we're in 34, zone 34, lowlands and coast from Gettysburg to north of Boston. If you read the 2, there's a lot of overlap, but it is very important to consider how hot it gets in the summertime, because something may be fully hardy here, no problem with the cold, but if the maximum zone recommended for the plant is like zone 6, you may have to really think about where you put that plant in terms of how much sun and what the intensity of the sun is going to be on where you put it. So you don't see too much reference to sunset zones. I think this is something that is used much more frequently out west. I don't know why, maybe because there's so much variation in the topography out there and it gets a lot hotter. But it's just something to keep in mind. Okay, let's talk about our light conditions. This can be very subjective. So usually when you see a plant in a catalog, it'll say full sun to part shade or full sun to part sun. And what do these designations mean? I mean, it's it is very subjective, but I'm going to generally say that full sun is at least 8 hours or more of sun between 10 o'clock in the morning and 4 in the afternoon. The afternoon sun in our part of the world, here in the Northern Hemisphere, is more intense because of the angle at which the sun hits the earth. Light shade, most things that like full sun will tolerate some light shade. It's between 6 to 8 hours of direct sun. That would be like the, you know, a 25% canopy coverage if you're at the edge of a woodland. So maybe the sun doesn't really hit the spot until noon or so, and then stays in full sun till the sun goes down. And that would be, of course, in the summertime when you've got long days. Then partial shade would be the equivalent of a 50% canopy coverage, like dappled shade. If you were in the woods, you'd get the little pieces of sun and shade, or if you have a clearing in the woods, you'll get, you know, the sun only when it's kind of directly and slightly either before noon or afternoon. Full shade would be under the canopy of a deciduous forest where everything is leafed out and you're not really getting any direct sun. And then there is finally dense shade, which would be if you're in the shade of a conifer forest, like if you've ever been in a hemlock grove, it really is very dark. I mean, just the darkness of the foliage is one thing, and it just makes very, very dense shade. And the other common source of dense shade is the shade on a building, shade of a building. The north side of your house is always going to be the shadiest part, and not a whole lot will grow there. Moss does really well. That's about the only thing I can think of. Okay, let's go back to sun intensity. So I said before that afternoon sun, more intense than the morning sun. And a western exposure is obviously more intense than eastern exposure because you're going to have sun in the east in the morning. You should also keep in mind how heat is reflected off of structures like your house or you know, paved surfaces like driveways, rock walls. That kind of heat adds to the sun's intensity. So you may find that if you have plants along a driveway that they're going to need a little bit of extra water. I'll talk a minute about house plants and sun intensity. This is where you put your house plants during the various times of the year is something you need to think about because of the way the sun hits the house and the angle of the sun. You're only going to get very less intense sunshine in an east or west window. So if you have a plant that's happy in an east or west window during the summertime, you may have to move that to a southern exposure during the winter in order to give that plant enough light. And you'll know it's not getting enough light when it starts leaning towards the sun or the source of light, or if the internodes, the spaces between the sets of leaves start to stretch out. That's a sign of not getting enough light. And if you bring your plants outside for the summer, which I like to do, you should not do that all of a sudden. Don't just bring them up from wherever they've been spending the winter and put them out on the deck because they will crisp and dry. You need to gradually adapt your plants to the outside because even if it's been in full sun inside, the outside full sun is much more intense than what's coming in through a window, and there will be more of it. So do that gradually, you know, like over a period of a couple of weeks, put it out each day a little longer, and it will adapt to the sun. Plants, by the way, will grow sun leaves, and it will grow a different set of leaves for the type of sun exposure it has. Like, for example, I have a Brugmansia. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Brugmansias. They're those, it's a very tropical looking plant, big leaves, and it has those downward bell-shaped flowers, which are very fragrant in the evening. It's a pretty common plant that people like to overwinter. And no matter what I do, it always sheds all its leaves when I put it outside, because it's just whatever leaves that have grown on it in the wintertime, those leaves are adapted to being in lower light conditions. And when I put it outside, even though I try to acclimate it gradually, it usually drops the leaves and it will grow a totally new set of sun adapted leaves. So if you see that happen, don't panic. It's just adjusting to the brighter intensity of the light. Okay. Now we'll go on to soil moisture. You need to consider on your site how much moisture or natural water is going to be supplied to your plants. So think about how far do you want to drag your hose. For sure, if you've got a vegetable garden, you need to have that in full sun, and that will need pretty constant watering. So that would be one situation where definitely I would recommend that you irrigate and do yourself a favor, install a drip irrigation system. Overhead watering of your vegetable garden is not a good idea, and it's a very inefficient use of water. The drip irrigation gets the water directly down into the root zone, and there's less chance of it evaporating or running off because it's dripping directly into the ground. So definitely a case where you want to, get your hose going. Another place would be if you have a plant that's a little bit more, has higher moisture needs, keep that closer to the house. It's just easier, of course, to, have the hose on hand to water your plants when they need it than to have to, take it out to the, the back corner of your lot where you've got to water your azaleas because they're in the sun. Things to consider on a slope. Slopes can be really nice, but they can be very dry, and they can also be very wet. It really depends on what's going on under the ground. I will get to that in a little more detail in a couple of slides. Dry shade under trees is something you will no doubt be faced with if you have maple trees, or really any tree on your property. Maples and Norway spruce are notorious for having surface roots that like to suck up any available moisture and not leave anything for anything you would plant under there. So if you find yourself having a hard time growing anything under a maple tree or a Norway spruce, you're probably best to just give up. Or I don't know. There's always Pachysandra, but even that might not do very well. There are plants that are tolerant of dry shade under trees, but you need to have the kind of tree that's going to allow you to dig underneath it. And that's a whole separate discussion, but I just want to point out that particular situation because we have it a lot. We have a lot of trees around here. So dry shade is pretty common. Dry sun, you can supplement with water, but generally speaking, anything that flowers, which is generally what we want to have, they want a lot of sunshine. If you don't want to water, consider succulents like all of our sedums. There's such a beautiful collection of sedums that are available out in the retail world now. And there are also hardy cacti, which I think the one that everybody sees is the opuntia with the big yellow flowers. But there are other hardy cacti that will, if you give them the right conditions, you have to amend the soil because they don't like winter wet, but they will survive. And they're not, they're okay with the cold, but it's really their winter wetness that you have to watch out for in order to keep them. Other things that do well in dry sun are any of your silver leaf plants, like artemisias. I'm thinking of the artemisias. There's several types of those, and what are the silver? Like there's there's a lot of annuals with silver leaves. The silver leaf plants are most of the time very well adapted to sunshine and minimal moisture. So again, the takeaway for all of that is don't fight the site. Don't, unless you want to, spend your time babying a plant that's not ideally sited. Look at your conditions and plant the plant that is well adapted to that location. Okay, let's go into a little more detail here about slopes. I happen to really like gardening on slopes. They have a lot of design potential. They can be very dry because naturally water runs downhill. And if you don't have, like this particular garden here is maybe about, I don't know, 6 inches of soil, and then there's outcropping, rock outcropping, ledge underneath here. So we here in Connecticut are blessed with many rocks in our soil, hence all of the rock walls that you see around. So with this situation, I had a little bit of a slope and a lot of rocks which had been pulled out of the ground when the developer dug the foundation for all the houses. I ended up on the piece of property where all the rocks got dumped. So I decided to use them, and I terraced the slope in order to create some more level areas. And I underlaid the soil. I did have to amend and add topsoil here because there just wasn't enough natural soil there. So in order to keep that soil from washing out, I used landscape fabric underneath it and kind of tucked it into the underneath the top layer of these rocks here. And that helped to keep the soil from washing out through the rocks and keep it in place. Oops, sorry. And I found that it was a really nice place to have plants that like to drape over the rocks. This happens to be down here on this bottom level, a type of Euphorbia. It's called donkey tail spurge, and it will stay with you because it likes to self-seed, but not uncontrollably. It's well behaved, even though it does self-seed. Thyme does really well in these situations. And I don't know if you can tell what this is up here, but this is Sedum kamchaticum, which is, I guess, from Siberia originally. Very hardy sedum, and it fills in very nicely and really does like these little spots of soil in between these rocks, and it'll colonize in there, and it just really makes a nice rock garden plant. So yeah, a slope is a nice place to take advantage of from a garden design point of view. This Juniper Procumbens, creeping juniper, which you see a lot in a lot of places, used to stabilize slopes, looks really nice growing down over these rocks. It actually grows all over the place. It spreads out in all directions. So it was planted, like I had this little bit of retaining rock wall here, and I backfilled it with soil, planted the junipers in there, and some of the branches were growing back up the hill, and some were cascading down onto the grass. And it just has a natural habit of doing that, and it looks really nice. As long as the deer don't get it, then it looks really bad. So Juniper Procumbens nana, creeping juniper, good rock garden plants. The other plant that I think did really nicely on the slope, this is in the front of the house now. This is a weeping larch, and this is all one plant. It started out as a little clump, and as it started to grow, it just, the stems were creeping out and kind of coming out at all different angles. So I propped them up with some tree stumps. We had trees taken down. I peeled the bark off some of the chunks of tree trunk that had been cut and left. And the juniper did a really nice, the larch did a really nice job of growing and draping itself over these little stumps that I put there, and it makes a nice cascading effect. This, in case you didn't know, larch is it's a deciduous evergreen, which sounds like a contradiction in terms, but it is a conifer. It's a coniferous tree, but it does shed its needles in the winter. Just a little thing to know. Doesn't take anything away from the tree at all. Really nice, elegant looking tree. This is Larix decidua, which is the European larch. There's also a native larch, which is known as tamarix around here. I'm not as familiar with that one. I don't know if there's a weeping form of it, but if you want the weeping form, you want the European larch. Okay. Going back to finicky plants and where to put them. This beautiful plant here is a Daphne Burkwoodii Carol Mackey. And it has, right now is when it's blooming. This is an old picture, but it's still there and it's blooming now, and it's fragrant, really lovely, and has this variegated foliage. The leaves have a nice yellowish, pale yellow, cream colored edge on them. Really a terrific plant. However, it's known to be a little bit finicky and needs a lot of moisture. I don't know why this particular corner, why it likes this particular corner so much. I was thinking because there was a downspout here that gave it a little bit of extra moisture, but the downspouts go down into the ground. So, you know, this is how it was done in newer houses. Well, newer, it's not newer anymore, it's 20 years old. But older homes, you won't see this as much. You'll just see the downspouts emptying out onto your grass or something. I think what's going on here actually is that there's a leak in the gutter above. So it gets a little extra moisture from that. But it's it was so happy that it started to smother this poor little Ilex crenata, this Japanese holly under here. So yeah, I had to deal with that situation. But the point I'm trying to get at is that if I knew that, since I knew that this Daphne tended to want a little bit of extra moisture, I didn't put it, I put it close to the house. I kept it close to the house. So if I had needed to water it, I didn't have to go very far with the hose. Okay. Other situations having to deal with water. You can either have too much or not enough. If you notice that your property has some standing water, you probably want to check that out and find out why that's happening. There's either things you can fix or there's things that you can't fix. So if you have water standing, you know, I'm talking like several days after a heavy rainfall, not just, you know, a day or two, but like more than 3 days or something, you might have a low spot, which isn't that big, and you can dig up the grass or whatever and fill it in. That's an easy enough thing to do. You might have the situation with the downspouts, which I was just talking about before. You can always redirect those, or you can place a rain barrel underneath to catch that runoff, catch the water coming off the roof, and then use that to water your plants. Or you can consider a rain garden. And I'll talk a little bit more about rain gardens in a sec, in the next slide. You might also have a problem with improper drainage. You know, if your landscape or your yard was not properly contoured to direct the runoff from perhaps upland areas when your house was built and the site work was done, you may have to correct that, but it's not that difficult to do. It's really just a matter of creating swales that will direct the water in the right place. You don't want to direct it onto your neighbor's lawn or into somebody's driveway or your own driveway. That just creates other problems. But it should be directed towards some kind of a catch basin. The other thing to watch out for if you have standing water in your yard is a problem with your septic, which you definitely need to pay attention to. Yes, I have had this problem before, and yes, there was a serious issue with our septic system. The whole thing had settled, and the connection from the house to the tank it's separated because the tank had settled. So the water that was coming out of the house was going directly into the ground and not into the tank where it was supposed to go. So yeah, I always thought that that area was just, naturally a little bit soggy, but no, that was not natural at all. So we had that fixed. The other thing you may be dealing with is compacted soil. And this is it's not that difficult to fix, but it does take a bit of attention in doing. And I'll talk a little bit more about compacted soil in a couple of more slides. Things that you really cannot fix if you've got standing water in your yard are obvious things like you've got a wetland. You've got a designated wetland. You're not going to be able to do very much with that because wetland soils are protected. You're really not allowed to mess around with those areas at all. Or if you do, you're very limited in what you could do. You just kind of try not to buy a house with wetland soil on the property. You may be in a floodplain, which is another thing you want to try to avoid. Can't do much about that. Sometimes you may have seepage coming up, and that's just natural water coming up from the ground source. And this can happen on a slope. Not the usual place, but it happens, and you're not going to be able to do anything about that. Again, this would be the ideal spot for a rain garden. And we could talk about that in a sec. If you have a high water table, you cannot do anything about that. You're going to have to deal with it. And a very special condition that probably will not occur in your backyard, but you'll usually, if you have a lot of woods on your property, you might find a vernal pool. I don't know if any of you are familiar with a vernal pool, but a vernal pool is it's a temporary body of water. I think I have a picture of one here. There it is. It's a temporary body of water that is habitat for our amphibian friends. So all of our frogs and salamanders use vernal pools to lay their eggs. So if you see, an area like this in the springtime, and you see the egg masses, this I think it happens to be salamander eggs, you've got a vernal pool. And these are important to these species because these pools will dry out later on in the year as the spring gets into summer. They start to dry out, which means that these pools cannot accommodate fish, and that's what the amphibians need, because otherwise the fish will eat all their eggs. So the drying out of the vernal pool corresponds with their metamorphosis from tadpole to whatever it is that they're going to be. And by the time this dries up, they're in their land form, and they don't really need the vernal pool anymore. So these are really unique habitats. They are protected wetlands. If you have them on your property, check them out, because seeing all the little tadpoles and egg masses is really cool, especially if you've got kids. Try to discourage them from taking the tadpoles out. It's much easier to let the tadpoles develop in the vernal pool. And besides, who wants stinky pond water in a jar by your back door anyway? And the tadpoles will die. Tadpoles will die. I know, I've tried it before. They don't survive out of this water. Much too much work. Just leave them be here and you can still enjoy them. Let me go back to this slide here. This is a rain garden. I don't know where this picture was taken or what the circumstances are. It looks to be surrounded by pavement. So this may be an area, a drainage area that was created in order to collect runoff. And a rain garden is a garden that is planted in a wet area. And the plants that are put in here are the thing that make it a rain garden. These plants are tolerant of having wet feet, withstanding water some of the time. And if you are interested in checking out that idea, this address here is for the NEMO program at UConn. And they have a lovely page that talks all about rain gardens and how to construct one and what kind of plants, what plants to put in there, a nice list of plants that you can use. they focus on natives. You don't have to use natives, but it is encouraged. I urge you to check it out because rain gardens are a really nice thing for the environment. Okay, let's move on to soil. Here we have our soil texture triangle. Soil is composed of 3 different elements or different particles. Clay particles are the smallest. Then you have sand down in this corner, which are the largest. And in between, you have silt. So all soil is some combination of clay, silt, and sand. Unless, of course, you have pure one or the other, but you don't find that too often. Whoops. And how do you figure out what percentage you have? If you're really adventuresome, you can go get a jar and fill it with water and shake and put some soil in there and shake it up and let it settle, and you'll see the layers settle out, and then you can calculate the percentages. If you don't want to be bothered with that, I suggest that you get your soil tested. I'll talk more about soil testing in a few minutes. But generally speaking, Connecticut has sandy loam. That is not everywhere, but it's kind of a broad generalization. You know, it's the most common soil profile in the state. So if you, you know, if your soil isn't obviously clay or obviously sand, or, you know, on the banks of a stream or a river or something, you're going to, and most likely have some kind of sandy loam, which is really nice for growing things in because it drains, but yet it has that nice loam, which is the, you know, balanced combination of all 3 of these things, which makes for a nice growing environment. So that is soil texture. Soil texture is your 3 different components and what percentage they are in the soil. Soil structure is another thing entirely. You know, people who study soil for a living come up with these different categories, which I find really hard to sort out, and it's really all very academic. I mean, we really don't deal with this in our home gardens because soil around houses is all disturbed soil, and you're not really going to see any of this kind of natural soil formation, except for maybe this one, which is kind of like compacted soil, which is probably the biggest problem you're going to see. But tilth is a better, I think, a term that people can relate to a little bit better. The tilth of the soil is, you know, what does it feel like? And chocolate cake crumbs is the way ideal soil has been described. I don't think I've ever seen chocolate cake crumb soil around here. We just have too much iron in the soil. We tend to have kind of reddish soil around here. You will see darker soils in the woods, in you know, underneath leaf litter. You'll get that nice humusy layer of leaves that have just decomposed, and maybe some earthworm castings, and you'll maybe have a couple of inches of that have that nice texture, and then it goes back to our regular sandier soil. So in order to keep your soil structure from becoming compacted, there are a few things you can do. First of all, in the spring, don't be too eager to go out there and work your soil before it dries out. Working wet soil is a really good way to ruin its structure. You'll end up with a mucky mess of hardened stuff, and it won't be pleasant. It will be very hard to work with it. If you find you have compacted soil for one reason or another, you need to make some amendments there. Often soil compacts because people are walking on it constantly. So maybe you want to try to create paths that change the traffic pattern. So another area, you know, give that compacted area a little chance to kind of loosen up naturally. Don't till your soil to death. A lot of people feel like they need to till their soil every year. Current practice is kind of discouraging this for a couple of reasons. Tilling And this is really something that applies more to farming, you know, on a larger scale. It's not so much to backyard gardening, but I think that the cautions are still applicable. You can destroy the microbial life in the soil by tilling it too much. And you also, when you till, especially if you till deeply, you are going to be bringing up new weed seeds that have been dormant in the soil. You know, once they get tilled and come to the surface, then they're getting all the right signals to start sprouting. So tilling can, you know, be a little counterproductive. What you think you're doing is getting rid of weeds. So what this really is all about with soil structure is optimizing the pore space between the little the soil components. And that's where all of the nutrient exchange takes place and all the chemistry takes place is in those pore spaces and on the surface area of all those sand and clay and silt particles that are in the soil. So having the right blend of that is what you need in order to have a nice fertile garden. Now, soil structure and soil texture are two things that you really have a very hard time changing on a large scale. Yes, you might have small areas that you can amend with different things, but changing soils, you really have to do a lot of adding of material in order to change the soil structure. The best thing that you can add to your soil to improve its structure or its texture, if you've got too much clay or too much sand or too much silt, is to add organic material. And that would be compost. If you've got a compost pile, you know all about good organic material. If you don't have a compost pile, you might want to consider having one, even just a pile of leaves that you let sit and decompose slowly. That leaf litter, that leaf mold, it's called, the wet stuff that's partially decomposed under the top dry layer is really nice to add to your soil and does it a world of good. Okay. The other thing you want to think about in your soil is the pH. The pH of your soil affects the availability of nutrients in the soil. So here in the Northeast, we tend to have a more acidic soil because of the parent rock that has decomposed, you know, over eons. It tends to, I think it's granite and basalt, and those tend to decompose into a more acid type of soil. So again, changing the pH is pretty hard to do. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. The main thing you want to think about with pH is finding out what pH you have. And then fortunately, most plants that we see in this area of the country are well adapted or prefer an acidic soil. So you really don't have to do too much. The one thing that people do around here is lime their lawns because grass really prefers a more neutral pH. So you'll see people liming their lawns every year, and it needs to be done every year because trying to keep that pH in the more neutral range rather than the natural acidic range is something you just have to keep after. So lime is alkaline and it will raise the pH some, and your lawn will thank you for that if you do it. So the nutrients in the soil are divided into macronutrients and micronutrients. The ones that we're most familiar with probably are your NPK, because of those are the letters that you'll see on the fertilizer bag. You might not see the letters, but you'll see the numbers 30, 15, 30, or 10, 10, 10, or whatever the composition has to be. But that is nitrogen, N is nitrogen, P for phosphorus, and K for potassium. Why? Because it comes from the medieval Latin calmium, callium. And along with those three, we have calcium, magnesium, and sulfur, our macronutrients that are in your soil. So an imbalance of any of these things can have different effects on your plants. And one thing I'm going to mention, when you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your plants, most of the time, you will not be dealing with a disease or an insect. Most problems with plants, and especially house plants, the causes are due to environment, whether it's pH or too hot or too cold or winter burn. It's abiotic, what they call abiotic problems, not having to do with something that is alive, like a disease or an insect. It's your conditions. There's also these micronutrients that we need, that the plants need in small amounts, and but just by looking at your plant, you're not going to be able to tell which nutrient. I mean, sometimes you can, you know, a plant will look a certain way and they'll say that's a sign of boron deficiency or something, but you know, a lot of these things, all of the symptoms look the same. Like when you see a plant that has chlorotic leaves, you know, when the veins are still green, but the spaces in between the veins of the leaf are all green, or sorry, are all yellow, that's typically a sign of iron deficiency. But what's really going on there, some of the time, it's not that there isn't enough iron in the soil. We have plenty of iron in our soil around here, so the chances of it really being iron deficient because there isn't enough iron in the soil are pretty slim. What's usually happening is that the pH is wrong and that the iron is not available for the plant to metabolize. So knowing the pH and correcting the pH can solve some problems. So the upshot of all of this is what you want to do, since you don't want to be mucking around with trying to find out how much sand and silt and clay you have in your soil, or you know, trying to figure out whether it's a boron deficiency or manganese deficiency on your own. It's pretty hard to do. You want to get your soil tested. And I highly recommend, if you are not familiar with the Cooperative Extension Office, which is on Stony Hill Road in Bethel. This is the same place where the farmers market takes place in the summertime. It's a very good place to know about. The Fairfield County Cooperative Extension Office is here, and they will, they have soil testing literature that they will give to you, which will explain to you how to take soil samples from your property and what to do with the samples once you have them, where to send them. The charge is much less than you would spend if you went to any kind of a private lab. And they have a package where they will do the macro and micronutrients for you. They'll tell you what your soil is missing. They'll tell you what the pH is. They also, as a routine, will test for lead, because lead is such a problem in some areas. They automatically test for it because it's just important to know if you have lead in your soil. And you might not even think that it would be an issue because, you know, lead in paint was outlawed, I think, in 1976 or something like that. But it could still linger in the soil, so good thing to know. As an additional charge, they'll also tell you what % organic matter your soil has. They'll tell you your soil texture, and they will also measure for soluble salts. Chloride from road salt can be a problem in some areas. So they'll tell you soluble salts if you've got an issue with that. And so in addition, you know, they're not just going to tell you what you have, they're going to give you the recommendations on what to do to improve any deficiencies that you have. So say you're, you know, you need more potassium in your soil, they're going to tell you you need to apply, you know, how many X number of pounds per square feet to your soil, and that will correct the deficiencies. One thing that they don't tell you when you are getting your soil tested is anything about nitrogen. because nitrogen tends to dissipate really quickly. Testing for it is not accurate, so they don't tell you information about that. But nitrogen deficiency is pretty easy to spot. Lower leaves that turn green, turn yellow rather, are a pretty sure sign of nitrogen deficiency. And yeah, just to have a proper fertilizer, you'll get all the nitrogen that you need. I was going to say something about soil. All right, it'll come back to me. All right, brain freeze, sorry. Okay, I want to talk a little bit more about siting and conditions that have nothing to do with the previous things that we've talked about. Thinking in particular about planting trees, you really need to look up and down and all around before you plant a tree. Obviously, do not plant trees under telephone lines. You'd be surprised to learn how many people do this or don't do it thinking that it's not going to be an issue, but they're not really taking into consideration the full-grown size of their trees. 20 years can go by pretty quickly, and you could not think that you're going to be around to have to deal with a full-grown tree, but it does kind of creep up on you. And we've all seen those sad-looking trees that have been butchered by the tree trimming crew. They look like Cookie Monster has taken a bite out of the there's this like C-shaped dent in the tree. The tree guys, they don't really think about aesthetics when they trim your trees. All they care about is making sure that your tree is not in the power lines. So try to avoid planting anything that's going to interrupt your power lines above. Also consider what's underneath. You definitely don't want to plant trees or shrubs anywhere near your septic system, because the roots will infiltrate and cause you a world of headaches. Planting too close to a fence is going to be a bad ending for the fence. When it comes to trees versus things like your septic system or a fence, it's the tree that's going to win out in the end. They're pretty amazing. They can grow around things and heal themselves. Yeah, not a good thing for your fence. So give your tree and the fence some proper distance from each other. Okay. Another thing you want to think about is a problem that I had. So I'll tell you my sad story of this Chamaecyparis that I planted in front of my garage. This is what it looked like when I planted it. It was a nice little, neat little, under control little baby mops. This particular shrub goes by a lot of different names. It's Chamaecyparis piscifera, which is Sawara, a Japanese Sawara or something like that, and it as a common name. But it's the rest of it that gets you in trouble. In its straight form, this Chamaecyparis piscifera is an 80 or 70 foot tall tree, and not too many people plant those. What you commonly see is its nana or dwarf form. However, nana or dwarf form on a plant label is a very relative term. When you consider that the straight species is could grow to be as much as 80 feet tall, a tree, a dwarf form that grows 10 to 15 feet tall may not be your idea of what a dwarf is. And that's the situation I ran into. I thought it was going to stay very small, which is, I thought I was getting, nana. Filipara aurea nana. Aurea means gold, nana means dwarf. And I thought that's what I was getting, but this was the tree after, I don't know, eight years or so. It was covering up the windows in front of my garage. And then another 5 or so years later, it was all the way up to the windows of the second story. I actually had to open my windows on the second story to top it. And that was fine. That kept it from getting any taller, but it did grow wider and it started taking over the walkway. And yeah, I did try to keep it under control by shearing it. It will take some shearing, but you can only shear this thing so much. It does not sprout from old wood. So if I were to cut this back into where there were no longer any green tips, it would die, just because all the growth happens on the outside. The inside is pretty much bare. So there's only so much that you can shear this thing in order to keep it under control. And the end of this sad story was that this year I decided to chop them down. So learn from my mistakes. Make sure when you're buying a dwarf that you are buying a real dwarf. And it's not, do your research, make sure that the dwarf is going to be the size of a dwarf that you really want it to have in wherever you're planning to put this thing. And be careful. And there's no way to really avoid this. There's no guarantee that you won't have this problem, but things get mislabeled at nurseries really often. Having worked at a nursery, I know how things can get mislabeled. It's very easy to do. And, you know, the difference between a 10 to 15 foot form of this particular tree and the true dwarf form, you know, could be, you know, a missing word or something like that. So go to a really reputable place, somewhere that you really, you know, you could rely on, that they haven't mislabeled their stuff, and be sure you're getting the plant that you want. Another one that's famous for this is this same kind of situation is Mugopine. Mugopine in its natural setting is huge. So we have the dwarf Mugopine, but dwarf Mugopine can get to be pretty big. So yeah, proceed with caution with dwarf Mugopine. Make sure you understand really how big the dwarf form is going to get, because it makes a very large foundation plant. It can grow, you know, a good 5 feet wide and 5 feet tall, which is pretty big when you have that in your foundation plantings. Another thing you want to consider when you're planting is what do you want what you're planting to do? Is it just there as a specimen? Is it being planted for a specific purpose? You know, cite your trees and shrubs with purpose in mind. And a lot of people want to add privacy. So the effect isn't really appreciated in this photograph, because I just took it a couple of days ago, and this Pusa dogwood hasn't leafed out yet, so it's not providing any privacy. But when I planted this, what I wanted to do was, I don't know if you can see it here, but we have a deck in the back of the house, and I wanted to provide a little bit of privacy so that when you're coming down the street, you're not looking directly onto our deck. And the way I did this was to walk up the street and look exactly, you know, as I was approaching the house, at where the line of sight is. And that's how I decided where to put this. And it worked out very nicely. Another thing you may want to consider when planting your trees and shrubs is what kind of shade the tree or shrub is going to cast. So this is a copperleaf beech, and my house faces west, which tends to be very hot in the summer. So it's taken a few years, but it's finally now starting to cast some decent shade. And I put this in front of the windows here, which these are bedroom windows up here, and this is dining room. Those rooms tended to be really warm in the summer, even with blinds on them. So having this tree here in the summertime, when it's all leafed out, it does a good job of shading this area of the house. And then in the wintertime, since it's deciduous, it sheds its leaves, and I get the nice warm sun in the winter, which is very much appreciated. Helps keep the rooms warm. So here's the summary of that idea. Put your deciduous trees on the sunny side where you want to have shade. And so that in the wintertime, when they drop their leaves, you have the benefit of the sun. And if you're planting evergreens, of course, you might not care about having the winter sun. Perfectly acceptable to put evergreens on the west or south side of your house for shade. Evergreens are also really good for creating a windbreak. Now, I had 3 Colorado spruce on, this is the northwest side of my house, and I put them there as a windbreak. And I'm glad I did, because in 2018, when we had the macro burst, I don't know what would have happened to the house. I like to think my trees that I put there as a windbreak did their job. They got blown over. Nothing happened to the house. Had to remove them, unfortunately, but I like to think that they, I thanked them before I cut them down for doing their job and protecting my house. And windbreak, yes, good idea for evergreens. Okay, let's talk a little bit about microclimates. Microclimates are special situations that you should be aware of in your landscape that create conditions that are significantly different from the overall environment. A rock wall is a particularly common area for creating a microclimate because, especially if it's facing the sun will heat this rock up and reflect this heat onto anything that's close by. So you really need to consider plants that are going to be able to tolerate that reflected heat on the sunny side of the wall. It's going to be warmer than the surrounding areas, and it's going to stay warmer at night because as the when the sun goes down, these rocks are still going to have a lot of heat in them, and it's going to shed that, give off that heat in the cool of the evening. So you need to have plants that are going to be able to tolerate that. On the other side, when the wind blows and hits the wall, you can get these little air currents on the backside. And you'll know you have this situation if you've ever seen leaves piled up against the back of a wall or something like that. The leaves that collect down here are there because of this little air current that gets created when the wind blows. And so that will, it'll be in the shade for one thing. And it will also, those leaves will also tend to keep the soil a lot cooler and moister. So you want to plant things that are not only shade tolerant, but that will be adaptable to that kind of cool, moist soil. They're suggesting here Siberian iris. I'm sure there's plenty of other things that would work in that situation too. Another type of microclimate that's pretty common is a frost pocket. Frost pockets happen in low-lying areas. They could be very big. I mean, it could be an entire valley, or it could just be a little bit of a gully. Say there's a stream or something, and there's that's part of your property, and the land goes down where that stream flows. So you'll end up with a pocket of cold air that tends to stay there. Of course, cold air it's heavier than warm air, it sinks. So frost will stay in this area longer. It will be colder in the wintertime, and you really need to be sure that take into consideration what you put there, because it can be as much of as a zone colder in a frost pocket. From the surrounding area. So be mindful of the hardiness of what you put into a frost pocket area, because it just may not survive due to the extra cold. Another type of microclimate, it says microclimate is probably not the right word. Microcondition, maybe you would say. I mentioned before that we tend to have acidic soil in the Northeast. However, there are areas, especially in Brookfield, where we have more alkaline soil, and that's because of something that has been called the Stockbridge Formation. This term comes from the USGS, the United States Geologic Survey. They have come up with categories and names for all the different soil profiles that they've identified. And the entire state of Connecticut has been mapped as to what soil profile and soil type. And if you're interested in finding out about this, you can go to either the USGS website, or you can go to the DEEP website and you can look up the soil maps, and you can see by little sections by section what type of what soil profile you have. But this particular one, called the Stockbridge soils, is characterized by marble. Now this photograph was taken, I think, on Route 7, and this is kind of a really unique sort of thing. If you're into geology, I urge you to pay attention on Route 7 when you're going north towards New Milford, where the road cuts have been done. You'll see this this pattern in the rock, and this is a sign of plate tectonics, where the ground was squished together, so you get this banding, and it caused the whatever soil was there or rock was there before to because of the pressure and heat and the pressure of the plate tectonics caused the rock to metamorphize into, in this situation, it was marble from limestone. And because limestone tends to be naturally alkaline, marble is too. So you do have patches of very or more alkaline soil surrounding these Stockbridge formations. So if you live close to Route 7, you may be treated, I would say you'd be treated to this type of soil. And I say it's a treat because one of the things that I'm interested in is alpines. And alpine plants tend to, a lot of the alpine plants prefer a very neutral or more alkaline soil, which you cannot get unless you, you know, take extraordinary measures to amend your soil, or if you happen to be blessed with this in your neighborhood, you can grow them here. And for those who are curious or chemically inclined, the progression that undergoes here, takes place here, is explained here. I'm no chemist, so I can't really say too much about this, but it has to do with calcium carbonate reacting with acidic water. The reaction releases, let's read this here. Calcite consisting of calcium carbonate can increase the pH, especially in acidic water, which we have. Reaction between calcium carbonate and acid water releases hydroxide ions, which are have a negative charge, and the result is an increase in pH. Now, if you understand that, I compliment you, because I really don't. It's been a long time since high school chemistry, but that's the chemistry of pH and why the limestone soils are more alkaline. And that's the end. Thanks, everybody. And I'll take any questions that you may have at this point.
Thank you, Kathy. For some of you who came in afterwards, we just request that you use the chat function for the questions for the Q&A, if that's okay, because we're recording and it's easier for privacy issues to use the chat function. So there was one question earlier, and it was in reference to a plant that I'm not actually sure offhand which one it was, but they were asking about deer and squirrel, the plants that are deer and squirrel resistant. So, I'm not sure what we were talking about at that time, to be honest with you.
Okay, I think I may know. The one I specifically mentioned deer in relation to was the juniper. That may have been it. I'll go back to that slide. It was the Juniper Procumbens, the creeping juniper that I had growing over the rocks. Yeah, you really need to protect this. In the past, I have put deer netting over this in the wintertime. I didn't do it this past winter, and the deer just destroyed this. It looks like a skeleton. It's such a shame. But the deer are well fed, for what it's worth. I assume that's the one. Maybe there was something else that somebody remembers. Was there another slide with a plant that somebody had a particular question on?
I actually feel like it might have come through just before you talked about this one.
Okay. All right. I mentioned this Euphorbia down here. Euphorbias are generally left alone. This particular Euphorbia is it. Think of a poinsettia. A poinsettia is a Euphorbia in the same genus as this plant. And this plant, just like a poinsettia, has that milky latex, which is very unpleasant. It irritates. You've probably been warned that poinsettias are not good for animals to chew on. It's not poisonous. It's more of a physical irritation that the sap causes. And this plant has the same exact latex when you break it. And so deer leave it alone. In fact, everything leaves it alone. I've never had this plant be eaten by anything. Thyme is another one that's pretty well protected from animals because it has such a strong scent to it. I find the scent really nice, but it turns off deer and rabbits and chipmunks and other voles, other critters tend to leave it alone. I've really never had an issue with anything eating thyme. This other one up here was this sedum. Yeah, I think sedums, no, not all of them. The sedums that we grow, like autumn joy, with those beautiful purple flowers, the tall ones, they get eaten. Why they don't like the lower growing sedums like this Sedum capchaticum and the other sedums that you'll see, you know, there's that Angelina, that really golden colored one. It's got little tiny leaves on it. It's very popular. You see it all over the place. They tend to leave those alone. I don't know why. I don't know what the difference is, but this has never been bothered by anything. Yeah, I definitely recommend that. As far as a deer resistant plant. There is a website, Rutgers University in New Jersey has a website that rated a lot of plants as to their deer resistance. And I have no idea what the actual address is, but if you were to Google Rutgers deer resistant plants, I'm pretty sure you'd get to their website. And you know, you have to take it with the understanding that deer do different things in different places. And if deer are hungry, they're going to eat no matter what you put up. You know, they don't read the Rutgers website, they don't care. But it's generally speaking a pretty good guide. One of the only ones I know that groups a lot of common landscape plants according to their deer resistance. So check that out. I highly recommend it.
Thank you. One other question, for for assessing your site, is there a time of year or, to assess the light and everything? Because of course it can change as the seasons change. Is there a good rule of thumb in how you go about assessing your site for light?
Uh, for your perennials and your deciduous trees and shrubs, I would say you want to look at it during the growing season, because over the winter they're going to be either dormant or they're dormant. The leaves are shed or they've just died back to the ground, and sunlight, how much sunlight is on there is really not an issue. For conifers or for evergreen shrubs, yeah, you probably want to think about, I think you probably should look at it in the summertime. I think having too much light for some of the conifers is probably an issue for some and not enough for others. But yeah, I'd say look at the summertime. It's just easier to do. You're outside in the summer, you're not really so much worried about the sunlight in the winter. And they kind of they're not really dormant, but they're semi-dormant, let's say. They're not growing actively. So summertime is when they're using the sunlight the most.
That makes sense. And someone commented that was a great talk and said thank you. Thank you for
You're welcome.
Okay, if there aren't any more questions, we can let Kathy go on with her evening. Thank you so much for speaking with us and sharing this information.
Is anybody interested in seeing the NEMO web address? That was the address for the, I can go back to the slide if you want to copy it down, because NEMO is not really easy to remember.
Sure.
Rain gardens. Where did my rain garden go? Here it is. So https://nemo.edu. Okay, for anybody who's contemplating a rain garden. Is there another website in here? Or another? No, it wasn't so much a website, but the address of the Cooperative Extension Office, 67 Stony Hill Road, for anybody who's not familiar with it.
And you can just bring your soil samples there. You don't need to mail it in.
Well, they don't do the testing there. The soil samples get sent to, I believe, to New Haven or to stores to Yukon. Mm-hmm. What they have there is the little brochure that explains to you how to take your samples. And it has all the pricing for the various tests. And if you want, and want to ask any questions about how to do this, or, whatever questions you might have about soil samples, there are people there who will be able to answer that for you. I don't know what has been going on there during COVID. Usually during the growing season, master gardeners are there and you can drop in at any time or call them if you have questions, anything relating to gardening, whether it's vegetable gardening, house plants, weeds, grass, you name it, anything to do with gardening. That's what they're there for. They're there to answer questions. They have a hotline, and they're not know-it-alls. Most of those people are there they're doing their training for their master gardener certification, so they are not going to be experts. But what they do have is an excellent reference library. So if they can't answer a question for you right off the bat, they will take your information, your phone number, your contact information, and whatever your question is, and they will research it and then get back to you. Wonderful. And frequently they will ask you to bring in a sample. of whatever your situation is. So you've got, you know, a disease leaf or whatever, you want to know how to treat it or what the disease is. If you bring them a sample, that's the best thing to do, the best way that they can diagnose what you have. So hopefully, I don't know if they're back, probably not in person, but they should be next year. And yeah, definitely worth taking a trip over there or giving them a phone call if you've got a gardening question.
Wonderful. That's a great resource. Thank
Yes, it is.
you. Okay, well, thank you again for the presentation, and we hope to see you at some more programs.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Kathy.
Good
Thanks.
night, everyone.
Bye.